and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and this evening I will be doing a series review for the Winnowing Flame Trilogy by Jen Williams. I first heard of this trilogy through Elliot Brooks' channel. She so far has only read The Ninth Reign, I believe, and she raved about it when she read it a couple of months ago. And when she described the synopsis, it sounded really intriguing and like something I would enjoy. And I did, very much so. This is going to be a rave review because I adored this trilogy. I would say The Winnowing Flame sits in the subgenre of science fantasy more than fantasy strictly speaking, though I won't really say why because I'd be spoiling elements of the plot. It also incorporates elements of horror, eldritch, I don't want to overuse the word Lovecraftian, but creepy eldritch horror bits. The first novel also won a British Fantasy Award, I think in 2018 perhaps, though I'm not entirely sure. So I will get into the synopsis for the first novel. The first novel follows three main characters, one of which is called Lady Vincenza de Grazon, that's how I pronounce it, or Vintage or Vin. She is a middle-aged, she's like 40-something, aged woman. She's very intrepid, adventurous. She comes from a rich family which tends vineyards, and she's very curious about the world around her and about her world's history. That world is called San, and what's special about San is that it has, over thousands of years, repeatedly been invaded and assaulted by a race of beings, creatures, which you quickly come to realize might be alien in nature. They are called the Jure'lia, or the worm people, and each time they've been pushed back by another people I'll come to in a second, they've left these massive wrecks of their warships and or spaceships. These wrecks ooze out something that makes nature around them completely haywire. Mutations go off all over the place. Animals get huge, develop eyes on their bodies, hence the eldritch horror bits. There are also these parasite spirits that hang around these wrecks, and they're like shiny luminescent beings that have bits of animals in them, and if they touch you, they turn your body inside out. So Lady Vintage is fascinated by all of this. She's kind of like a bit of an Indiana Jones figure. She's an avid researcher, an avid explorer, very hot-headed, sometimes a bit too intrepid for her own good, and she basically wants to crack the mystery of the Jure'lia. As I said, these Jure'lia were driven off during each of their invasions by a people called the Eborans. The Eborans are a bit of a mix between elves and vampires, extremely long-lived, lived around and worshipped a tree deity called Ixeril, and drank its sap. That sap gives them their longevity, their beautiful looks, their strength, etc. So that's the elvish component. At the end of the very last Jure'lia invasion, however, the tree stopped giving sap. So instead, the Eborans resorted to drinking human blood, sometimes with the consent of said humans, more often than not, without, and that led to horrific wars. But the kicker is, drinking human blood brought upon them a crimson flu, which poisons their own blood and basically, well, kills them in the long run. They waste away for decades, even centuries, and end up dying in horrible pain, and they become forgetful. It's pretty bad. So that would be the vampiric element, if you will. Now, each of these invasions were called reigns because each time they happen, this tree Ixeril, in addition to giving away this magical sap that ensured the Eborans' long life, health, etc., it grew pods, and out of these pods emerged incredible fantastical creatures called war beasts. So think griffins, dragons, giant winged leopards, foxes, wolves, giant bats, things like that, and these would be bonded to Eborans, and with the Eboran army they would drive off the Jure'lia. And so there was one last of these invasions, and it was called a reign because the tree Ixeril rained these pods down upon the Eborans, and so that was the 8th reign. And the first novel of the Winnowing Flame trilogy is called The Ninth Reign, and I'll leave it at that. The second tome, by the way, is called The Bitter Twins, and the third is The Poison Song. Each title has, well, a direct link to an element in the books, which is always something I also enjoy. And so I talk about these Eborans. There is an Eboran character, a main character called Tormelin, or Tor. He leaves Ebora because with the Crimson Flu that decimated his people, his civilization has basically collapsed. Most of the people he knew growing up are dead. The city, the capital city of Ebora, is in ruins, and so he decides to leave home to still enjoy the bits of life that can be enjoyed, and he ends up in the employ of Lady Vintage and is basically her hired muscle because he's a very skilled swordsman and has a great personality, but I'll get back to the characters' personalities in a minute. And the third main point of view is that of Noon. Noon is a fell witch. So in the world of Sarn, you have fell witches, and fell witches can create winnow fire by absorbing the life energy of other organisms. So they'll touch something, a blade of grass, a person, an animal, suck up their life force, and then produce this ethereal green-bluish flame called winnow fire, which burns particularly hotly. Unfortunately, in the world of Sarn, fell witches are, well, reviled and feared because, well, more often than not, the gift or curse, whichever way you want to see it, manifests in very young girls, and it produces horrific accidents and the like, and they are scooped up by a group called the Winnowing, and they basically, imprison, exploit these women, and so Noon is at this Winnowing, but it's not really a spoiler because it happens fairly quickly. She joins up with the two main characters of Tor and Vintage. So that's an overview of the plot for the Ninth Reign. They are these three main characters exploring the mystery of the Jure'lia. What exactly happened at the end of their last invasion, the Eighth Reign? Why did the tree deity Ixeril die? What is going on with these wrecks surrounded by parasite spirits and creating these swaths of land that have gone crazy with mutations called the Wild, etc., etc. So the Ninth Reign itself kind of works as a mystery story at its core because you're trying to figure a lot of things out. You get a lot of exposition on the world of Sarn, you discover the main characters. I would say books 2 and 3 are less about mystery. Although, no, I say that, but that's not really true. There are mysteries as well, but then there are different kinds of stories with more action and just different dynamics. But so that very first book, The Ninth Reign, definitely is very mysterious. You learn a lot of things, and at first, you're really wondering what's happening and trying to figure things out along with the main characters. All of this was written very well. I think that writing style itself was pretty straightforward. However, straightforward and just elaborate enough, precise enough to depict the world of Sarn in a beautifully vivid fashion. I was really immersed in that world. I could picture it in my mind. I was there with the characters. I was alongside them, exploring the wild, exploring the different city-states of Sarn, trying to figure things out, and the weird wreckage of the Jure'lia. There's nothing specifically poetic or florid about Jen Williams' writing, but I wouldn't say it's basic either. I hate to compare to another author because I don't want to sound negative, but for example, I would say Brandon Sanderson is a fairly basic style of writing, or as I call it in my review of Mistborn, fairly commercial. I think Jen Williams isn't at that level. It's a bit above that without being that poetic or descriptive. I mean, I didn't write down that many quotes in my quote book from The Winnowing Flame, and yet that world, the world of Sarn, has stuck with me. It's still stuck with me. I had to take 4 to 5 days to digest the impact of the story and of the characters and of the world, and you can't do that without good writing, right? One thing Jane Williams did, which I always enjoy in books of speculative fiction, I've talked about this before, almost all of the chapters in all 3 books are prefaced by a letter, an extract from archives, diaries, especially the private diary and the letters of Vintage, so one of the main characters, Lady Vintage. This serves as a great exposition tool for the world building, though it also fleshes out the character of Lady Vintage, her relationships, her history, and how that history is intertwined with the history of her world Sarn. So that I always loved that writing narrative device. There's only a in the present timeline, you have, of course, flashbacks for all of the characters to develop their psychology, their history, but otherwise the story goes from point A to point B. It is a multiple points of view story, which I always love. You have these 3 main characters, Noon, who is about 21 years old, fairly feisty, lots of trauma, and, well, I mean, has lived in horrible conditions up until the sort of beginning of the Ninth Reign. You have Tormund, who's like 400 years old because he's one of these Aborans, and he's a great swordsman. He's very sarcastic, but that's also because he basically escaped the ruin of his species and of all the people he knew in his life. He's quite vain, he cares a lot about his clothing, he enjoys the simpler pleasures in life, a good bottle of wine, a good session of sex, basically. And then you've got this lady Vintage, a 40-something black lesbian woman who's a great explorer, intrepid, a bit hot-headed, sometimes takes risks she probably shouldn't, and she knows it, but she's also so intelligent and great at figuring things out and linking different elements together to try to make sense of this puzzle that is the Jure'lia / worm people. So you have mostly their points of view in the Ninth Reign. You have additional characters that become main characters in books 2 and 3 as well, so they get points of view chapters. The points of view chapters aren't necessarily, paired with a specific character. They'll be paired with a character who's perhaps in the company of another character, so it's more situational points of view chapters, but then you also sometimes have additional tertiary character points of view chapters to flesh out the story. And pacing-wise, I never had any issue whatsoever with the pacing. I tore through these books. Book 3 is about 560 pages. I read it in 3 days. It was so good, I couldn't stop. I was so invested in the story and the characters. You have slow bits, which are more about exploring, unraveling a mystery, trying to understand what's going on, setting up what's going to follow. You have extremely fast-paced moments in the stories as well, to do with conflict, to do with escape and dire situations, and, everything in between, but I never felt the story lagged, or that it was a bit boring, or that it was too fast. The pacing was perfect, had no issue there whatsoever. So yeah, writing-wise, it was exactly what it needed to be. I guess I could have enjoyed a bit more flourish to the prose itself, but otherwise, it was great. The Winnowing Flame Trilogy, I think, is a series that really stands out by its characters. I'm not specifically a character-driven reader. I think I place more importance on world building and plot, though I do value good character work. I mean, I love A Song of Ice and Fire, so obviously that would matter to me. In the case of The Winnowing Flame, the character work was absolutely superb. I really bloody cared about these characters. I was so invested, entangled emotionally with what was happening to them, and they're brilliant. The character work was absolutely brilliant, beautifully fleshed out. You could really tell that Jen Williams took time through the narrative, through the plot, to explore each character's backstory, to flesh out and build their psychology, to explore their traumas, their flaws, their qualities, their values, and along the story, you learn about these people and you care about them, even though they are very flawed people, but that's what makes them relatable. So, incredibly credible and beautiful character arcs overall. Each character most definitely feels unique and is memorable. I still think about these characters. It's been so long since I've been so invested in fantasy, or speculative characters. All characters are speculative. Characters from a work of speculative fiction. It's been so long since I've thought about them before going to bed, and they stand out so clearly in my mind. I'll reiterate, you have, at least in the Ninth Reign, you have this core cast of main characters, Tor the Aboran, Lady Vintage, and Noon, and they have different ages, they have different points in their life stories, in their levels of maturity, and yet they all complement one another in a way, because there's a very strong sense of found family in these books, which I also loved. The character dynamics were absolutely brilliant, top-notch. That's one thing. The characters themselves were great, but then the interactions between characters, the character dynamics were great. Like I said, in book 2, you have the addition of, characters that you do find in book 1, but then they become more important in books 2 and 3. And those characters are brilliant as well, and you care about them as well, and the way they interact as this little group, but also with outsiders, how they deal diplomatic relationships, trying to get help to face what they face in books 2 and 3, etc. A little bonus, a little cherry on top, great diversity in these books. Like I said, Lady Vintage is, I mean, I said black, but it doesn't really mean anything in that world. She's a darker skinned woman. She is a lesbian, though it's never stated that she's lesbian. See, that's what I loved about the representation in this book. It's not really mentioned as a thing, it just is. It's present in the books, and that's it. And that, to me, is the best kind of representation. You don't need to justify, you don't need to talk about it. It's just there. You have lesbian relationship. I mean, a lesbian relationship. You have a male homosexual relationship. You have a straight relationship as well. And it's just there. And there's no issue about it. It was great diversity and representation. And so skin color-wise, I mean, even Noon isn't quite Caucasian. I mean, I pictured something like someone from maybe the steppes of Asia. So yeah, I don't know, like Mongolian or something like that, or maybe Mediterranean. She has like an olive skin, but she comes from a people that lives on long plains of grass. That's why I pictured like Mongolian, something like that. Then you have the Aborans. They're pale white because, you know, that elvish vampire vibe, but then lots of different hair colors and things like that. So the world of San is well fleshed out. It's variegated. It's colorful. It has, well, yeah, variety, and it was beautiful. It was just beautifully done and seamlessly done. Like I said, nothing is made of these elements. They're just there and they work. And a quick note also on romance specifically. So I talked about the character relationships. The friendships are wonderful. The sense of found family, the relationships between the main characters. And there is also romance. There's a gay male romance that was absolutely wonderful. There's also a lesbian romance. There's a straight romance. I am not at all a big romance person. I think I've stated this before. I don't really care about it. It has to be present in what I read. It has to be done well. And lo and behold, for once, great romance. Romance that was, well, I mean, I don't even like using the word romance, but non-platonic relationships that were believable, that were organic, that developed naturally, that didn't feel forced or insta-lovey or nothing like that. One of the main relationships is a bit of an on and off kind of thing, cool then hot, but it makes sense because the characters are freaking messes. They're oodled with drama and with complicated issues. So it makes sense that it takes time for them to develop that relationship. But no toxic relationship. That's the beautiful thing. They're complex relationships, but there's no abuse, there's no misogyny, there's no toxicity, there is consent. There is a bit of sex in these books. Very mild, not explicit at all. But guess what? There is consent, and anyone who says consent is not sexy doesn't know what they're talking about. Consent is sexy AF, because that was present in one of the sex scenes, and I was like, yes, thank you, why can't we have more of this in fiction? I mean, I've read a lot of like older, more classic SFF in these past, I don't know, 10 months. I've forgotten what that felt like, you know. Not necessarily super healthy, but just non-toxic, non-cringy, non-sexist relationships. You know, it felt like a breath of fresh air, so thank you, Jen Williams. And final little note, I won't go into too much detail here because, again, I don't want to spoil these books. But you have animal companions, doesn't really cut it, beast companions, or at least beasts that are their own characters. You have fantastical creature main characters. It's not super apparent at first, that's why I won't go into too much detail, but you throw in fantastical creatures at me, I'm gonna love it. Like, I'm just gonna love it. Dragons, griffins, yes, 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 please give me more. And they are great characters as well, with their unique personalities. And the interactions they have with the humanoid characters are brilliant, and you care about them as well. You care about all of the main characters, so 10 out of 10 for that. Now I'm going to touch on the world building. I'm going to try, again, to be as spoiler-free as possible. That being said, be warned that I might, you know, get into spoilery territory. If you want to skip this bit, I'll put a timestamp. Overall, the world building you get in The Winnowing Flame isn't that deep or extensive in any one of its components, which makes sense. We're not talking about a huge fancy series a la Song of Ice and Fire, a la Wheel of Time, a la Tolkienverse. So that makes sense, and I was not expecting that. For the trilogy, though, it was very, very good, very high caliber world building. World building that was sufficiently well done and well fleshed out that, like I said, I felt I was in it. I felt I was there. San came alive for me, and I can picture it right now in my mind. It has a distinctive flavor, a distinctive imprint. in my memory. The author took the time to give you all these little sketches of different cultures, of different languages, different peoples coexisting in this great world of Sarn. You even know that there are actually 2 continents in Sarn. Now, one thing, however, I cannot forget the author, though it's not necessarily her fault, or at least, the people around her, her publisher, whatever. There is no map for the Winnowing Flame trilogy. And that is an unforgivable crime. I need my fantasy maps, or my science fantasy maps. There's no map. What's up with that? But okay, that's one of the only flaws in an otherwise great reading experience, but I really would have enjoyed a map, because this is a big world with different regions, different city-states, different cultures. I will say though, now I think about it, the religious world building wasn't that prominent. There are bits here and there. That perhaps was left a bit by the wayside. But that's fine. That's not really the point of the series. You really get enough of these elements to make this world feel alive. There's a history to that world, most notably through the conflict Sarn has had with these alien creatures called the Jure'lia throughout thousands of years. You have the people of the Aborans, which are themselves living histories since they live extremely long lives and have this history spanning thousands of years. For the world building alone, I'd honestly give an 8 to an 8.5 out of 10, even though, like I said, it's not that terribly deep in any one of its components, but together it makes something that's greater than the sum of its parts, basically. Now, that being said, you do get elements of world building which are a lot more fleshed out because they have a direct link to the main characters or are particularly relevant to the plot. I could mention, well, Ebora, the civilization of Ebora and the Aborans. You get to learn a lot about the relationship with the tree deity called Ixeril. You discover where they come from. I'm not going to say more than that. The war beasts and their great, grandiose history, and also the fact that it's fallen into ruins. Sadly, you get quite a bit about the Plains people, which is a large confederation of different tribes and different subcultures that's linked to Noon because she comes from the Plains. You also have the Finneral people, which are important to one of the main characters you meet in the Ninth Reign, but you get a lot more of in the Bitter Twins and the Poison Song. They definitely have their own culture. You have the Winnow Fire. The Winnow Fire is a very important world-building element. After all, the trilogy is called The Winnowing Flame. There's a very important reason why that is, but again, spoilers. Because at first you don't think there's gonna be, well, much made about it. It's just, this magical ability, and then it becomes really bloody important to the plot. And you have the Winnowry, like I said, which captures these fell witches and exploits them to produce a drug called Acaris, and Noon gets, well, she frees herself, really, from the Winnowry. Now, one little detail I'm just going to throw in there because I freaking loved it. The Winnowry uses giant bats to get around. Giant bats as mounts. I've had dragons, I've had griffins, I've had giant birds, giant bats. That was so freaking cool! I don't know, I love that. Giant bats. What's special, I think, about the Winnowing Flame, though, it's nothing about it is truly that new or revolutionary. Like, you'll recognize lots of beats from it, but they're shuffled around in a very unique and original way, so it feels really fresh. Again, I don't want to diss on other series, this isn't the point of my review, but I was really disappointed by, for example, the Broken Earth trilogy. Everyone was raving about how original it was and groundbreaking, etc., etc., and there were bits about it that were a bit different, sure, but I don't know, nothing about it as a whole really struck me as that original. And with the Winnowing Flame, it's a complete 180. I have the completely opposite reaction. None of its component parts are that new original, but taken together, it's unique. It's so special. It is science fantasy with bits of eldritch horror, and it works. It just freaking works. Science fantasy, like I said, it's not, strictly speaking, fantasy. I, once again, cannot really get into why without spoiling major elements of the plot. I'll just say that I got some Prometheus vibes from it. I got some vibes from Lovecraft, but again, I don't want to overuse that term. I was reminded of certain scenes in certain sci-fi movies, and yeah, it mixes witches, vampire elves, and weird spirits that rip people to shreds, and then you've got these fantastical creatures, dragons, griffins, and all of that is shuffled about in a nice little shaker, and it produces this beautiful new whole that's nice and shiny. As science fantasy, I'll say this, if it matters to you, there is no real magic system As such, there is the Winnow Fire. There are the Fell Witches. And Winnow Fire is very, very important to the story. It is magical. I will say this, it remains something magical, but with a twist. You do have the tree god Ixeril with the sap. That is magical, but again, there's a twist with that. So there is no magic system as such, unless you count, flying around on dragons that breathe fire and griffins and stuff like that. So it's very light on the magic systemizing, let's put it that way. There is a bit of magic, but again, with a twist, and you have to read the series to find out what those twists are. And a little note for those of you who appreciate these things like I do. What was also quite refreshing about the Winnowing Flame is that the world is not by default patriarchal. It's a little thing, but again, I've had fun exploring older SFF, enjoyed lots about it, mind you. Be the first one to say that. But for once, you don't have a generic fancy world inspired by late medieval, early Renaissance Europe. That is obviously misogynistic to reflect, the world we have lived in and continue to live in. And, I'm not against that, but out of principle either. A Song of Ice and Fire features a very misogynistic, not the whole world, but at least, parts of that world. And there's a reason for that. You can do lots of interesting things about it, do commentary on gender relationships, etc., etc. So I'm not dissing that specifically, but for once, it was nice. A nice little change of pace to have a world that isn't by default patriarchal. The sexes are pretty much equal in most places described in San. There's no rape, no overt sexual violence. The characters are oodled with trauma, like I said. The younger female MC, Noon, has a lot of trauma in her past, but it doesn't have to do with rape or sexual violence. And you know what? For once, I like that. So again, thanks to Jen Williams for creating her world the way she did. Theme-wise, I don't think it's a series that delves too deeply in any one theme, or that it is a series with an overarching main heavy theme. However, there were several thematic threads running throughout the books, and it gives you something that is more than the sum of its parts in a way. One thing which really crept up on me as I was reading the series, I was like, yeah, I really feel it, and you feel it through the characters. That's something I will add. The theming is really done through the characters and through the way the characters interact with one another and with the world. And that theme would be, there is a big theme of trauma, basically, but a specific type of trauma. It's the deep, fathomless grief at losing your world, basically. Okay, I'm going to say apocalyptic grief, basically. This applies to the Aborans, in a slightly lesser way to Noon as well. Again, won't go into why, because spoilers. But the Aborans, and this is not a spoiler because you learn this at the beginning of the Ninth Reign, the civilization of the Aborans, which has stood for thousands of years, which has saved the world of San 8 times, repelling the invasions by the Jure'lia, their civilization has collapsed. There are still Aborans around, but the vast majority of them are dying from something called the Crimson Flu. You have the main character of Tor, and also his sister. I didn't mention the sister yet, but the sister's very important as well. She's also actually a main character. Tor has a sister called Hestilian. And, they're surrounded by a city that has fallen to ruins. Everything is deserted. Basically think post-apocalyptic TV series, like 28 Days Later, The Walking Dead, things like that. It's sad, depressing, and you've got a few of these Aborans clinging to life in the shell of a city, and they know that they're the last of their kind, and they're going to die out. Throughout the pages, you realize how much this has impacted Tor and his sister, Hestilian. And this obviously has been touched upon in lots of movies, books about the apocalypse, or, exploring a post-apocalyptic setting, or just the end of the world. We talk about climate grief in our world and things like that. You really feel it in those books through the characters. Just imagine you're alone, or you're near enough to it, and everything's dying. Your world is dying. Your world is coming to an end, and it fucks with your psyche. Not unlike what you find in Children of Time. That's one of the themes I had mentioned in my review. Slightly different because, you do still have this pocket of humanity trying to survive on a generation ship going to another planet, but those people are also freaking traumatized because they have to live in small space knowing that planet Earth has been effed up and they might not even find a new planet to settle on. Here it's even worse. I mean, the Aborans are not going anywhere. They're the last of their kind. Their world is dying. And that is something profoundly freaking traumatic, to go through something like that. The sadness, the emptiness, the despair. And like I said, trauma in general is kind of a fixture for not Lady Vintage, but at least Noon and Tor and Hestilian, another character called Aldacer, who is Hestilian's and Tor's cousin. Trauma, but I will add a positive twist to that. Trauma and overcoming it. This would be a second theme, a sub-theme, traumatic events which impact you as you grow up. They mark you, shape you in your life, something which I've also explored in works of literary fiction to do with sexual abuse, but another topic for another day. So having these horrible events that shape you, they mark you, they become a part of your identity, and, well, your soul is scarred, might even be broken in some places, and so you carry these flaws within you, but you have to address them at some point. But what I like in The Winnowing Flame is that it has a positive outlook on the subject. There is hope. You can overcome trauma, you can overcome. I mean, flaws might not be the right word because it's not necessarily your fault, but they become flaws in your soul, like flaws in, like, you know, a gemstone in that sense. You can overcome these flaws. You can overcome that pain, those scars. Make something out of it. Make something out of all that darkness for the betterment of yourself, of others, etc. Then I'll mention something which, again, isn't quite a theme. It's just a running motif. And it's that of found family. I love me a good found family, and the one in The Winnowing Flame is just absolutely brilliant, because not only does it involve different types of humanoids, it involves animal or beast characters, fantastical beast characters. And so obviously this touches upon the sense of identity, finding your place in the world, finding your tribe, your people, those who will care about you, those who will be able to accept your flaws, perhaps even your wrongdoings, but then, you know, move on alongside you, support you in your recovery, in your path to bettering yourself. I'll then touch upon another theme, or thematic thread, like I said, which is the interplay of change and preservation. This is kind of where also the big bad, if you will, the Jure'lia, come in. Though again, I can't really say too much because I don't want to spoil the story. Change and preservation. Change, obviously, partly illustrated by the fall of the Aborant civilization. What are the remaining Aborants going to do? How are they going to adapt to a changing world? But preservation also because, so, like I said, the Jure'lia, with the wrecks of their war/spaceships, they've, you know, started these processes of massive mutation in the land around them. You've got whole swaths of land called the Wild, and there's some creepy, weird, oozy things in the wild. Ginormous mushrooms, trees that have weird colors, animals that have bits of other animals in them. It's crazy. So you want to preserve the patches of land which are still pristine, which are still normal, and at the same time you see that the humans of Sarn are adapting to this change. For example, Vintage's family, like I said, they tend vineyards, and they make wine out of big, fat mutant grapes. So, you know, they found an opportunity out of this wild to do something good, I guess. And same thing with the people of Finneral, which ride giant bears. So yeah, it's a balance between change but preserving the good, but then, you know, the one constant in life is that everything changes. So yeah, it's a delicate balancing act, trying to find the good in each, trying to preserve what can be preserved and accept that some things will have to change, and trying to adapt to said change, etc. And finally, a big theme with two parts: equality, which might sound surprising given what I said about the fact that the world isn't particularly patriarchal, sexist, misogynistic. It's not. There isn't racism. Well, no, there is racism. There isn't colorism. There is racism. Because, like I said, once the Aborans couldn't get sap from their tree god anymore, they resorted to drinking human blood. Practically, that meant waging war on a lot of humans to, well, get food. Well, not so much food, because they can't eat regular food, so they're not purely vampiric, but drink blood to stay healthy and live long lives. And beyond that, the Aborans have always felt superior to the rest of humanity. They are beautiful beings. They're very strong, amazing artists, warriors. They've defended the planet from the invasions by the Jure'lia, and they feel superior to humans. But again, without spoiling let's just say that you always have to pay a price for hubris. And the Abhorrents, through our main abhorrent characters, get a massive smack in the face for their superior attitude. And then finally, so the second half, you have equality, you know, finding peace with your fellow humanoids. And that is, well, through cooperation. Once you've had your big smack in the face and realized that, well, okay, we might have been a bit arrogant here, we're not that superior, let's try and all get along. Let's try working together. Let's try seeing each other, well, as humans, maybe not exactly as humans, but as worthy living beings. And it's beautifully illustrated in these books, the cooperation of, well, first of all, the members of that main found family, but also with other peoples and trying to work together to stop the, well, eventually a threat you learn about with those Jure'lia/aliens. Cooperation and respecting one another's differences, finding strength and complementarity through one another's differences. And then before I get to my concluding remarks, I will allow myself a bit more leeway with a spoiler-full section. So yeah, that was really hard talking about the theming, the world building, without going into the details of books 2 and 3. I loved the bit about the Abhorrents basically being the result of aliens messing about. That's the Prometheus vibe I got. They were just a seed, an experiment by the Abhorrents, and they're actually modified, mutated human beings. And so they get a big smack in the face for having been so arrogant and superior, for having massacred a shit ton of humans back in the Carrion Wars. And I mean, it was hard seeing how it affected Tor, but at the same time, I was like, mate, your lover's a human being. You shouldn't have this attitude to begin with. And it's a fascinating thing also to watch with Hestillion's character. I had a hard time knowing what to make of Hestillion. I don't think it's a fault in the psychology of the character as it was created by the author. She was just a very complex character. At times I thought I could, get what she was doing. At other times I was just, you're just an evil bitch, die. And the relationship she had with Celephon, and Celephon I generally felt sad for because he was truly innocent and did the right thing in the end. And yeah, the sense of superiority that Hestillion had, dude, you're just a human being that's been mutated. But at the same time, that was interesting because Tor is so sad and depressed, like, you were just a footnote, an accidental experimental footnote in a freaking spacefaring civilization's history. But at the same time, he's like forgetting thousands of years where his civilization was great and saved the world 8 times. So I'm like, dude, bigger picture. And then I freaking guessed it. I knew that the Winnow Fire was also going to be something alien in origin, and that its origin was going to be that creature that helped the Abhorrents get to San. I freaking knew it, I guessed it, and I was right. I was so happy to see that, conclusion in the Poison Song. It still remains a magical element, mind you, because you don't really know what the spirit of the Winnow Fire is. Some kind of alien creature, but I mean, concretely, what is it? So it does remain a bit magical, but yeah, I love those science fiction-y elements. It's just really, really good. And then I do want to touch upon the ending. The ending tore a big fat freaking hole through my heart. I knew that was coming, but I cried so hard. I was like, no! I'm a sucker for self-sacrificing endings. I love them, but at the same time, if I really get attached and invested in the characters, they destroy me. Wow, did I feel that ending. Holy crap, I haven't felt a story. I haven't felt characters like that in a long time. And Noon's character arc was so freaking beautiful. And even the ending, it left a few loose ends, I guess. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. It was bittersweet, but it was perfect. Absolutely perfect, but just tore a giant hole through my heart. Oh my god, the ending. Holy crap. I cared so much about these bloody characters. And the war beasts. I was like, Vostok was, no! It was just, see, I don't have the words. It was such a great ending. So yeah, I just let myself go about the ending of the series, and I cannot say a single thing. I'm not going to say what the ending is like in terms of emotional impact. I'm not going to say anything. I don't want to spoil anything. You really, really need to read these books. I want to say that the series was amazing. I haven't gone into a series, I haven't gotten to a work of SFF literature like this in a long time. I love the Children of Time, Children of Ruin duology, but this one, the Winnowing Flame, just grabbed my emotions by the fistful, squeezed them, in a lot of different ways. I just cared so much about those characters. I was immersed in the universe of San, intrigued by the mysteries held therein. It was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience. It was a great, great ride, and I can confidently state now that it's a new favorite for me. The Winnowing Flame is a new favorite SFF series for me. I gave it a 9 out of 10. So happy I read them. It has stuck with me for several days. That's how strong the impact was on my mind and my emotions. And I would most definitely, highly, highly recommend you go out and read them. I mean, the last time I've been this involved emotionally was when I read Putney, and that's a novel of literary fiction about a very specific subject that I relate to in a very specific way for specific reasons. But so yeah, this series, just wow, great series. Please go out and read it. You will, I mean, I don't know, you might regret it, but it definitely worked for me. Very happy I read it. I should probably stop repeating myself. I sound like an idiot now. So yes, this was my review, my rave, rambling review for the Winnowing Flame trilogy by Jen Williams, which comprises The Ninth Rain, The Bitter Twins, and The Poisoned Song. I hope you found it informative, interesting, and most of all made you want to pick those books up. I hope you'll have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Take good care of yourselves, and I shall see you again fairly soon in another video. Bye-bye!